You said, imagine watching someone you love drown, and that's what it was like watching my dad drink himself to death.
We all knew it was happening. We didn't admit to ourselves that it was happening. We were all in denial. I can't actually ever remember my dad without a drink. We just thought my dad was strange. So I turned up to his house and it was a mess. And you know, it's this council house. This alcoholic in there on his own, absolute state of the place. He's on the bed, shaking, there's a tinge of yellow to him.
He's got jaundice now.
Yeah, there's ever so slight tinge to him. I said, Dad, I'm calling you an ambulance. I think you have liver failure. The doctor took all of my dad's symptoms and he looked directly at me and he said, under no circumstances are you to take alcohol away from your dad. If you do, he will die.
Hello, I'm Elliott Wald, addiction specialist, and welcome to another episode of Coming Clean with me. Joining me in the studio today is Sarah Drage. Sarah is the child of an alcoholic parent, and I thought for a change it'd be very interesting to take a completely different perspective. Instead of talking to the person with the addiction, I thought it would be different to talk to the child of a person who had an addiction to alcohol. Welcome, Sarah. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Wow.
Thank you.
Got a lot to get through. So, Sarah, tell us about your dad, who's Steve, and where he was born, what person he was, what was his character like, what he did for a living. Tell me about your dad.
Oh, God. My dad. Do you know what? My dad's Steve. He was a Yorkshireman, and he had the quirkiest sense of humour. Like, he really did. Like, if anybody who would meet my dad would come across this tiny little Yorkshireman with just the cracking sense of humour. He had the slapstick humour kind of personality to him. And he was amazing. He was very ahead of his time. And what I mean by that, the way he thinks, the way his belief systems, like even back in the 90s, he taught me and my sisters, was three of us, he taught all of us to be independent and not reliant on a man or anyone. Instead of saying things like man up, he would say stuff like, well, woman up, or it was just so... He ingrained independence in all of us, very ahead of his time. The way he used to think, he was a builder. He used to own a chain of properties. He was a property developer and he'd flip properties. And yeah, he went through something incredibly traumatic, really, really traumatic. Something I don't really talk about publicly, but it was a matter of life and death. And it saw us move from Yorkshire to France, from France to Kent, and he became addicted to alcohol because of it.
Because of this event that happened?
Yes.
So prior to that, he wasn't addicted to alcohol?
No, I would say family members would always say that he was a heavy drinker. Okay. So they would always say, you'd catch my dad at a party and he had a can in his hand, or he had a little whiskey glass and a bottle of, he used to drink Bell's whiskey. I think, is it Bell's whiskey?
Bell's whiskey.
Yeah. And that was his drink of choice. So it was always there, I believe. I can't actually ever remember my dad without a drink.
Right.
It was always there. I think he always used it as a crutch. Yeah. When it became really apparent was when we were a little bit older and we dissociate the drink with the personality change. And
I believe your dad's dad, was he a drinker as well?
No, I believe my granddad was sober.
Okay.
Yeah, my granddad was sober. Him and my dad were really close, really, really close. And it was actually his death that triggered the death of my dad's relapse.
So your dad's dad, your grandfather, passing away, was one of the triggers, the instigators of increasing his drinking from socially to it being a problem. Is that what happened?
So he was sober about 14 months before my dad died. He went to a detox facility and he was detoxed from alcohol. Did really well, super proud of him. Didn't follow up any kind of psychological support. So it was almost like he's off. He's not an alcoholic anymore. That was what we thought as a family. You stop drinking, that's it. He's not an alcoholic anymore. We won't talk about it. We won't discuss it again. It was almost like a secret that we all just brushed under the carpet, and we all just thought, that's it, he's done. And I remember somebody once said to me, your dad will always be an alcoholic. And I got really offended by it. But looking back now, I understand that. Yeah, he was. He didn't follow up any psychological support, didn't treat any of the trauma that he'd been through, the depression, the anxiety. And what that meant was when my granddad died in March 2017, my dad relapsed quite significantly.
It sounds like beneath the surface, he was trying to hold it all together. And then when his father passed away, your granddad, it was just a catalyst that was just too much for him to deal with.
I would 100% agree with that. And even looking back now in the way he was personality-wise and the things that he would say, he was absolutely trying to hold it together.
And how many years ago are we going back when he was in the height of that alcoholism?
I think as a child, he was always a heavy drinker.
As a child of what age?
When I was 7, 8.
Okay. And how old are you now?
I'm 34.
Okay, so we're talking about 23 years ago?
23 years ago, but it wasn't really apparent then. I still had his personality.
Okay.
And it was a slow decrease in the way he presented himself. So it might have, when we were teenagers, that's when it really, really shone a light as to, okay, there's a problem here. We're worried about coming home. And this is what's really important. And it's really lovely to be asked about him as a person, because he was a sensitive, kind, caring, loving, amazing man. But when he was drunk, he wasn't like that. He wasn't violent, but he had an aggressive tone to his voice. He had a lot of resentment. He had a lot of anger, a lot of unresolved anger. And it was really difficult to be around him. I was never frightened of him, but I was always on edge around him. I was always worried about what mood is he in. And when we were teenagers, that's what it was like coming home. I remember I'd ring my mum and I'd say, what mood is he in today?
What's he like?
Yeah. What has he been drinking? And if he'd been drinking, then I'd go home and I'd sit in my room.
And this is at school
yeah,
age?
this is school age.
Wow.
Yeah.
The reason I asked about how long ago this was and when he was in the height of his alcoholism is because if you go back 20 years, it was a very different time to today in 2024. Like, you know, it was frowned upon. You know, we have sober parties now. If you're that age that you go out, we have alcohol-free, you know, beer and wine and spirits. So we didn't have any of that. And I think with alcohol being so readily available, listen, you cross the road to an off license, and people not understanding, that must have been really difficult living in the family with a dad who was an alcoholic.
It was tremendously difficult. We didn't talk about it. We weren't allowed to talk about it. We didn't even really talk about it to each other. We all knew it was happening. We didn't admit to ourselves that it was happening. We were all in denial. We just thought my dad was strange.
Were you in denial because you didn't want to?
Yeah, a bit of both. I think we were so afraid of the stigma. Like, when everything happened to my family, what happened to them, we ended up losing everything. So we'd all of a sudden been catapulted into a life of poverty. So we went from having everything and not going without to all of a sudden searching behind the sofa for 50 pence to put in the electric machine. It was literally, it was like that. So we ended up living on a council estate. There was such a stigma attached to that, especially back in the early noughties. You know, Shameless was huge at that point. Frank Gallagher character and the council estate and the alcoholic. So I really went above and beyond to portray this sensible, respectable, overachieving individual to almost convince anybody looking in that we weren't like that. So I was so worried about being stigmatised and discriminated against.
I think you're probably doing that, A, because being, you know, stigmatised, the way people looked at it at that time, but also part of you as a young child didn't want to believe it. I think there's part of you was trying to hide it. Part of you was going, this is my dad, you know, because there's two parts to your dad, right? There's the dad when he's not drinking, and there's dad when he is drinking. And they're two different people, completely two different animals, like.
Yeah, 100%. And this is the thing. This is what was so difficult. And I always say to people now, looking back, and even now with the work that I do, I always say it would have been easier had my dad not been a nice person. Because I knew what my dad was like. I knew his character. I knew what he'd been through. It was almost like I had that level of empathy and compassion for him. And I desperately wanted to fix him. I wanted to get in there. I wanted to fix him. I wanted to try and change things. I knew that he wasn't that person. And I was so I just wanted to protect him. I want to protect his reputation, protect him from the stigma attached to it, protect the family, and make him better.
Did your dad acknowledge his alcoholism?
Towards the end, he did, yeah. Yeah, he did. And that was tough. He cried. I remember getting a phone call from him, and he said that he was sorry, that he didn't want to be like this, and if he could change, he would. He went on to apologise even further and said that, I know I'm making you anxious. And at the time, I was really struggling with my mental health. I had a really, really severe form of health anxiety, which, as a consequence, we later discovered was a manifestation of I couldn't control my dad's health, so I desperately had to control something, so I projected it onto me. And I know my dad blamed himself for that. He told me.
That's a lot to carry, right? A lot to carry. There was something that you said. You said, imagine watching someone you love drown, and that's what it was like watching my dad drink himself to death. I mean, you touched on it took an emotional toll. Your mental health got subjected to. How else did it affect your life and your sister's life?
In every possible way, it affected our lives. I moved out of the family home at 19, not because I wanted to, but because I felt like I had to. I needed to get away from him. Loved him dearly, but I couldn't watch that. I couldn't be subjected to that. So moving out that young affected everything. It had a ripple effect on what I did at university, for instance, what subject I chose.
What did you choose?
I chose crime and policing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. There's something unconsciously driving you towards that.
Yeah. Because I was a performer. I used to do performing arts.
Okay.
And I felt that if I went to university, I'd make my dad proud, because I would be the only one in my family to attend university. And I thought that might fix him. And because of what he'd been through, I wanted to have that level of criminology and that criminology knowledge to try and help and support. So I felt like if I did that, I could help my dad here. I could fix things. I remember thinking it. But it weren't really what I wanted to do. And yeah, I look back at that and think, if I would have had my time again, it would have been different. I would have gone down the performing arts route. I'm really passionate about that. But I didn't.
So really what you're saying is actually your whole life tilted in a different direction to what you might have gone through if your dad hadn't had an alcohol addiction, because you might not have gone to university to choose that subject. You might have gone to performing arts. That in itself has completely changed your life in every way.
Oh, definitely. Everything really, even down to my maturity levels. When I said earlier on about portraying this respectable, sensible character, I went above and beyond that even at 19, 20, 21. So I wouldn't be going out drinking. I wouldn't be partying. I wouldn't be going out with lots of different guys. I was very, very almost obsessed with coming across respectable.
Did you drink?
Not really, no. Maybe a little bit, but I never got to the point where I was like some of my friends.
And what about when you were like 19, 20 and you went out with friends and not drinking like your friends did, but how did you feel when friends of yours were drinking excessively around you? Because that must have happened. And then reflecting and thinking about your dad, how did that affect you?
Subconsciously, I think it made me feel uncomfortable. It's almost like I had this subconscious resentment towards it. Like I knew what it was causing at home and I didn't really want to, I think I was scared of it. I was scared to be around it. I was scared to become my dad. So I avoided it. I'd be the designated driver. Or I would be like, oh, I'm saving money or I'm doing this. Or I'd try and avoid it as much as possible.
And how did the fact that your dad had an alcoholic addiction affect your choices with boyfriends growing up? Like as a teenager, when people go to the pub and they drink, how did that affect your choices of the men that you would have dated?
I didn't date a lot of people.
Okay. For that reason?
Possibly. Looking back on it, yeah. It goes back to that respectable image, must come across respectable. I remember speaking to a friend of mine and I'd broken up with my school boyfriend. I was with him for a few years, and I was 19, and she said to me, "The next guy you meet, you'll marry." And I was like, what are you going on about? And she said, "Well, you're looking for that perfect person. You're looking for that perfect person. So the next person you'll meet, you'll marry." And I was very, very overly sensible. I didn't commit or date anybody who I weren't serious about. Then my husband came along, and that was it. Like, with it, I'm still with him now. It's been 15 years.
You were looking for a stable home environment because you didn't have one.
Yeah, I was. Yeah, I was looking for stability. Absolutely. And when I got that stability, my anxiety developed.
And when you first, that's interesting. We'll cover that in a minute. Oh, sorry. Just kicked her. Lost my thought now. When you first started dating your husband, did your husband go out drinking socially?
No, he was never a drinker. Still isn't a drinker.
I wonder why.
And do you know what? I can honestly say I couldn't be with a drinker.
And that's what I meant by when you were growing up dating, your filter process, you it's like, I'm not dating that. I'm not. If someone drinks, someone goes to the pub, drinks excessively, no. You were there. The whole of your life was journeying towards one event, one change. You wanted a family, you wanted a loving environment, you wanted probably a husband that you could depend upon, support, be loving, be caring, be reliable.
Yeah.
And you wanted a family and not to replicate what you'd been through.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say that.
And what was your relationship like with your dad when you moved out at 19?
Up and down. So there were brief patches where I'd catch him where I would say he was partially sober. So the drink hadn't consumed him. And what I mean by that is his tone of voice hadn't changed. He wasn't on the sofa passed out with the curtains drawn. He wasn't slurring his words or staring into space. When he was drunk, he had like an intimidating look about him that would want to talk about the past and would want to talk about what he'd been through. And whatever you said to him, there was no reasoning with him. There was no getting through to him. So I would, at that age, I would argue. I would scream and shout, and I would say horrendous things to him. I would tell him that, this is all your fault. You're doing it to yourself. You're weak. You're this. Like, I said some awful things to him. Told him I hated him. At times I wished he was dead.
But that's just hurt, that moment in time.
Yeah, but do you know what? There were times where I did wish him dead. And that sounds horrible, but I'd be lying if I said there weren't. There were times where I thought, this would be so much easier if he weren't here. This is so hard. Because I felt like I was living a double life. I felt like I was masking all of these issues at home. I had ADHD at the time. I've only been recently diagnosed with it. So there was a lot of masking anyway with that. And I never spoke about anything. I was always portraying this perfect, sensible, respectable person. And then internally, there was this anxiety at the back of my mind. Is he okay? Is he alive still? How much has he drank? What's he going to do? What's he going to say? As it was constant, he was constantly consumed by it. I could never escape it. And I remember I developed an ability, and I wouldn't call it, actually, it's not an ability because it come out as something else. But I remember when my daughter was born, Esme, my eldest, she's 12 now, and he was absolutely amazing. And these are the amazing patches with him where, because I was a young mum, again, another stigma attached that I was desperately trying to escape. I fell pregnant when I was 21, had her when I was 22.
Looking for the perfect family you never had.
Exactly, yeah. But he was amazing. And I remember saying to my dad, "Dad, what have I done? I've ruined my life." And he said to me, "You've not ruined your life. Your life's just about to begin." And it changed everything. Like, it changed absolutely everything. And then I bonded with him a little bit more. But then when I held my daughter, I remember looking at her, and I remember the moment I was in hospital, and I remember thinking, because my dad was there, he waited in the waiting room, and he'd come in at 3:00 in the morning, and my mum had said to him, "Don't you drink, and don't you make sure you're sober." And he did, bless him. He turned up and he was sober. And I remember looking at my daughter and thinking, God, how can my dad do this to me? I love her so much. like that instant love, that instant connection you have for your child. You're overwhelmed by it. And then it dawned on me that how could my dad put me through this? Does he love me enough? I didn't understand it at the time, didn't understand addiction, didn't understand what he was going through. But all I had in my mind was, how can you do this to me? Then his drinking escalated and started getting worse at that point. And I remember having to compartmentalise. I had this baby to care for. I'm now living in a family home with my husband. I'm a young mum. I'm dealing with all the hormones and the changes and the adaptations there that come with life. Dealing with, we're both in our early 20s, no career path. We didn't have a clue what we were going to do. So I had to compartmentalise when I would worry about him. So I made a pact with myself and I said, right, you're only going to worry about your dad when you're with him. If you're not with him, don't think about it. You focus on the family. You've got a child now. You need to focus on being a mum. And that's what I did.
Adjust your priorities.
Yeah. I adjusted everything. But I still had, again, and this is where it becomes complicated, and some people might think I'm contradicting myself, because there were moments within all of that where I would have my dad, who was not so drunk. He would go up and down in phases. It weren't like he was completely off his face all the time. And this is what was really difficult for the outward person or the outward family member to understand. They didn't see it all the time. They didn't see what happened behind closed doors. He would come round and he would see us and he'd spend time with us. And I even let him look after my daughter. But there were other times when he'd dip and go to a real low point that other people wouldn't see. And he was that good at it and that deceiving with it. And he became a master at hiding it, that when he died, somebody once said to me, I thought you was being dramatic. I didn't think he was that bad. And I remember thinking, I told you all this, he's bad. But he was so good at hiding it.
Yeah. I think every addict wears camouflage.
Yeah.
I think every addict hides. I think every addict hides their problems, hides it from themselves, hides it from other people. It's a tough one. But in 2015, you and your sisters staged an intervention after your dad turned up drunk at a family holiday. How did this intervention play out?
Oh, God, that was the start of all of it. I turned up to meet my sister, and her husband at the time pulled me aside and said, your dad's drunk. He's really bad, really bad. Probably the worst I've ever seen him. And I thought, God, God's sake. But at this point, my youngest was born. She was 5 months old. I had a 3-year-old, 5-month-old baby. And my sister had just found out she was pregnant. And it was a shock. So there was a lot of emotion in the air. And I saw my dad and he was bad. Like, he was the worst. He was quite volatile. He was very, said some awful things to me, like horrendous things to me. And I remember, again, I took that role of, I'm the eldest. I'm going to fix this. Don't worry. I'm going to take charge. So my husband took the girls and I said to my dad, you're not coming on this holiday. We really wanted you here and was really looking forward to you being here, but we can't bring you on this holiday. It's not fair on the kids. It's not fair on my sister. It's not fair on all of us. You're going to come along and you're going to spend it asleep and you're going to ruin the atmosphere. You're going to put us on edge. We can't have this. And I drove him home and he was crying and he was telling me at this point, he was coughing up blood, and there was no awareness or understanding around what that meant. And because we'd been in this situation so many times where we just thought, okay, you almost ignore them a bit. You don't take it seriously. You think you'll sleep it off and we'll go back to normal. This time I was so angry. I was so cross this time. And I thought, we cannot continue to support this anymore. We have to move ourselves away. So I rang my sisters and we had our holiday, and I said to the girls, under no circumstances are any of us to go anywhere near him until he admits he needs help. I knew we were my dad's weakness. I knew the love that he had for all three of us, that unconditional love, that bond he had. I knew us girls were his world. By that point, my mum and dad had separated. My mum had moved out the family home, and we were all my dad had left. And I knew that, and I used that and weaponised it against him. And I said to him, I'll check in with you every day by phone. You're not seeing your grandchildren. You're not seeing me, and you won't be seeing my sisters. And we did that, and we kept it up for 3 months until one day I had a phone call from him, and he was crying. And he said to me, I'll do anything you want me to do, because everything I've been through is insignificant in comparison to losing my girls. And I thought, wow, we've gotten through to him. We've done it. And I was so proud of him. And I remember saying, right, that's it. We're going to make it happen. We're going to get you detoxed. You need to go and see a doctor. We need to go to a detox facility. We need to get some help. And he was such a proud Yorkshireman. And the stigma didn't just affect us, it affected him. He was worried about what people thought of him. He was ashamed of himself, and he said that to me. And when we walked into this charity detox facility, it wasn't very nice. And we sat there, and he sat there, and I could see the embarrassment in his face. I could see his face was just, he was humiliated. And I looked at him and I said, I'm so proud of you. I know this is really hard. I'm really proud of you. And we went in, and the doctor didn't even speak to my dad. He spoke to me. My dad had turned up drunk. And that's when it kind of hit me about how serious it was and the symptoms my dad was showing, and the dependency and how bad it was. The doctor took all of my dad's symptoms, and he looked directly at me and he said, under no circumstances are you to take alcohol away from your dad until we have come in and we've detoxed him. If you do, he will die.
Absolutely correct.
And I remember sitting there and I was just taken back by it. I thought, wow.
Because he's dependent.
He was physically dependent.
Alcohol, physically dependent. You can't just stop somebody who's physically dependent on alcohol. You can't just go, right, let's just turn the tap off today. You can't do that. You have to titrate the alcohol all the way down. You have to detox them. Yeah, you cannot do that.
But we didn't know that.
Yeah, there wasn't much information out there all those years ago, was there?
No, not at all. I remember pouring it down the sink. I remember thinking I'd be helping him if I watered down his vodka.
Of course.
Or I poured the wine down the sink. Or I would force him, you don't turn up drunk. Don't turn up to my wedding drink. Don't have a drink all day at my wedding. And then he'd start shaking. I didn't realise what that meant.
He didn't drink during your wedding?
No, he didn't.
So
I really...
No matter how strong his alcohol addiction was, you were so important to him that on that day, the most important day for you, he stepped up.
Oh, he really shook though. Looking back on it now,
but that wasn't
really
his
shaking.
fault that he was shaking.
No, it wasn't.
He did what he could to control the situation, to be there for you on your day sober.
Yeah. Like I begged him. I remember saying to him, if you turn up drunk, I need you to walk me down the aisle. If you turn up drunk, I will never speak to you again. All of that spiel that I said to him. I think by the end of the day, my mum pulled me aside and said, he needs to have one. He has to have one to stop the shakes. Again, you didn't understand it. And I just said, okay, nodded. But he got through the entire day, delivered a speech, which I could see made him uncomfortable. I would have done it so differently now had I known what I know now. But back 10 years ago, I didn't really understand it. But he got through the entire day.
You sound like you're blaming yourself. I would have done something completely different.
There are times I do blame myself. Absolutely. I think, but I don't feel it anymore.
It was probably one of your dad's proudest moments to be at your wedding and to maintain his sobriety during that day. That was a massive thing for him to achieve, and he showed you in that moment in time what you meant to him.
Yeah, absolutely.
How much was your dad drinking? Like, what quantities were we talking about?
Towards the end, what we know of was 1 litre of vodka a day. Now, we had the detox, but prior to the detox, my dad used to drink cider, lager, just weak. He had the occasional whiskey, but by this point he weren't earning a lot of money, so we didn't really have a choice. So it would be low alcohol. You'd laugh at this, but ironically, my dad used to get called a lightweight by family members.
I don't laugh at that because I hear this a lot, because people seem to be under this impression that, sorry, I paused for a minute, because my best friend passed away about 8 years ago, and the girl that he had dated years previously had remained very close friends with him, and they were Shanine. And a month before he passed away, she passed away. And I remember many a Wednesday evening going round to my friend's house to eat dinner together, and Shanine was there, and loved this girl, great girl. And I would say to her, let me help you. Let me help you get over your alcohol addiction. Let me help you. You know, I'll do it for you. You know, you're a friend. And she wouldn't. And it wasn't that the quantity she was drinking. She'd get up in the morning and drink 1 can of beer, but that 1 can of beer was putting her back on that level.
Yeah.
That was the dependency. And I remember saying to her, and she had a child, she still has a child, she's no longer with us, but the child must have been about 5 years old at the time. And I remember saying to her, do you not think that's something enough to live for? Why don't you want to stop drinking? And my friend used to carry her to the toilet at that point. She couldn't even walk to the toilet. So I've seen that, you know, firsthand, how debilitating that must have been for you, the family. How did your mum deal with all this?
So, you know, my mum was great, actually. I think I used to blame my mum, thinking that she was enabling him because she would buy it for him. And I used to remember getting really upset and angry. But my mum was caught between a rock and a hard place, because she couldn't do right for wrong. If she would have kicked my dad out when we were 15, 16, when it was really horrendous to come home, then he would probably have died. He wouldn't have had anywhere else to go. There was no family around. It was just us living in Kent. So she put up with a lot. And she always used to say to me, you know, your dad was never like this. This isn't the man I married. He's not like this. Until enough was enough. And I never blame my mum. Like, she did what she had to do and she had to get away, and I don't blame her one bit. She waited for all 3 of her girls to be moved out and older before she did it. But even, like, the day he died, she was there holding his hand, like, giving him a kiss
She
on the
never
head.
lost the love for him.
Oh,
She just
God,
couldn't
no.
deal with living with him.
Yeah, yeah.
And what physical symptoms started appearing that were signs his body could no longer cope with the alcohol?
So when he relapsed, and actually, like, even when he was sober, he would tell me little things. But I didn't know. I didn't know what we were looking for. I didn't understand it. But I remember when he was sober and he wasn't drinking, and he definitely wasn't drinking, because I could always tell. I could always tell by the tone of his voice, the look in his face, the glaze in his eyes. I was so expertly placed to decide whether he'd been drinking. I could pick up the phone from my dad. He could say hello, and I'd say, you'd been drinking. I would know.
Yeah, of course.
So I knew he was sober at this point, and we were on our way to go swimming. He was coming swimming with me and my daughters, and I needed another adult, and he come with me. And he said to me, he said, oh, and it weren't like my dad to discuss his medical issues with us, ever. It was never like my dad. But he was scared.
He was a strong Yorkshireman.
He was a strong Yorkshireman, absolutely. But he was scared. There was a bit of fear in his voice, and he said, oh, I keep my wee's really orange. And I went, oh, it's all right, Dad. Like, it's probably like, you know, you're not drinking anymore. Your body's adjusting. And he went, yeah, you're probably right. I went, book a doctor's appointment.
Liver's going.
And he went, yeah, I'll do that. When we got swimming and I saw him, he was really quite conscious and was holding around his belly and everything. And he was very slim everywhere else, like his arms, his legs, very slender, but his stomach was so hard.
Distended?
Yeah. And there were little veins that you could see, like little spider veins all over his belly. And he had man boobs, like quite prominent. And I could see he was quite conscious of covering it all up. Didn't think about it.
How
at
old
the
was
time. He was 59.
So he probably found that his testosterone level was dropping, his estrogen level was increasing with the alcohol and the effects on his liver and everything like that. He was admitted into hospital, right?
Yeah, so, and this is where it gets really, this was really traumatic. So he relapsed. My granddad died March 2017. He relapsed again. And you think, oh God, here we are again. Like, we'll go through the detox program again. He's got to admit that he needs help. But by this point, I felt a level of exhaustion and helplessness that I'd never felt before. Now, it had been 15 18, or how long it had been by this point. Yeah, a good 18 years of putting up with this behaviour. And I was exhausted. And I remember thinking, I don't know what to do. I genuinely do not know what to do now. Like, I feel helpless. And I felt like this was where it felt like watching someone you love drown and you can't get in and pull them out. And I remember crying on my on the phone to him on my way into work, and he was crying. And I said, Dad, like, please, why are you doing this again? Why? I called him I told him can I swear?
Fucking do what you like.
I said, I'm really ashamed of what I said to him. I said, I fucking hate you. You're a horrible cunt. I hate you. It's really unlike me to say those words. I said, and I hate you. And I put the phone down. I was so angry. I thought, you've been sober. You've done so well. We've bonded. We've connected. I adore you. I absolutely love you. Why are you doing this again? I don't understand it. And I just was so frustrated. I've never felt frustration like it in my entire life.
Did you think in that moment you were losing him?
Yeah, I knew it.
Yeah.
There was a part of me that knew what was happening, and I thought, why are you doing it? Like, stop it. Just stop. I didn't get it. And I put the phone down on him, and he rang me back, and he was crying, and there was something different in his mannerisms and his tone, and he said, did you mean that? I said, no, I don't. I love you. Like, I love you so much. I just can't watch you do this to yourself. It is painful. It's hurting. Like, I don't know what to do to help you, Dad. Like, what do I do? And he promised, okay, Monday, it was always Monday, I'll stop, Monday, I'll go to the doctors.
Tomorrow mentality.
Yeah, I'll go to the doctors on Monday. And I always believed him. Every time I always believed him. Monday come round, I get a phone call from him, and he's frightened. He said, I'm coughing up blood. And he was contradicting himself. I went, right, I'm on my way. No, don't worry, I'll be fine. I'll be all right. And then he would almost gaslight me to call me dramatic. Oh, it's no big deal, you're just being dramatic. But you've just told me you're coughing up blood. So I turned up to his house, and it was a mess. The whole place was a mess. It was just disgusting. And, it's this council house, this alcoholic in there on his own, absolute state of the place. He's on the bed, shaking. There's a tinge of yellow to him. And
he's got jaundice now.
Yeah, there's ever so slight tinge to him. I said, Dad, I'm calling you an ambulance. I think you have liver failure. I've been Googling the symptoms and I'm really worried. And in that moment, I'd been so used to being that protector and that eldest, and I'm going to fix you and I'm going to take control. And I was so like fiercely that independent, I've got this. In that moment, he regained that control and he shouted at me. And he said to me, he swore at me, I am not fucking getting in an ambulance. Don't you dare call that ambulance. You're being dramatic. There is nothing wrong with me. I am fine. And I walked away. I left and I went shopping. And I thought, do you know what? I can't watch you do this to yourself. I'm going. I'm done. And it took a lot of therapy for me to get over that, because I thought if I would have called an ambulance sooner, maybe he wouldn't have gotten as bad as he did. And that was a Friday at this point. 2 days later, my sister calls me, and she'd arrived home because that Monday appointment my dad was talking about, I'll do it Monday. He did have a doctor's appointment booked for the Monday. He did stick to his word, and he did say, I'll go to the doctor's Monday. So we made that appointment, and my sister came to collect him, to take him. And he was partially conscious, passed out on the floor in his living room. My sister had to climb through a window. She had a baby in the back of the car, and I don't know how she found the strength, but she dragged him to the door and managed to get him in the car and drove him up to A&E, because my dad only lived 5 minutes away from A&E, so it was quicker to do that. And she called me and said, he's in a bad way, you need to get to the hospital. And I always remember this moment, because I was never a spiritual person when my dad was alive. I'd been to university, I'd done a science-based degree, very science-minded, didn't believe in premonitions or anything like that. I kid you not. Before I got that phone call, I I was driving to work and I had this flash, this vision so clear that he wasn't going to be around, that my future was not going to wouldn't have my dad in it. And then the next flash was me reading his eulogy at the crematorium. Then I get that phone call and I just went into a state of shock because I knew what was coming, but I weren't admitting it to myself. It was almost like the logic part of my brain, or that part of me didn't believe it and shut it off. So the subconscious knew what was coming, but that logical part of me that was hanging on to hope and wouldn't believe it was ignoring it. I had to turn my car around because my feet were shaking too bad to drive, and my husband come to the hospital with me. And when we got to the hospital, I saw him and he was sat up in a wheelchair and he looked white and he wasn't with it. And I remember looking at him going, oh, thank God, he's fine. He's all right, he's sat up. And I hugged him and he looked at me like he didn't know me. And he looked at my sisters all confused. And he tried getting up and he said, where are my car keys? I need to go and see if my girls are okay. We're like, Dad, we're here. Like, look, it's me, Sarah, look, I'm here. And he went and he just looked like he didn't know me. He was so confused. And the doctor said, is he drunk? I said, no, this is different. This isn't drunk. There's no glaze in his eyes. He's white. He looks a bit yellow. He's not drunk right now. This is different. He was almost confused. He didn't know who we were. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know what was happening. He was just like a shell of a man. And it was really quite rapid that he went downhill as soon as he got into A&E. So he got moved into majors, and then we had some bloods done and the bloods come back, and we had a load of doctors around us, and we were all laughing and joking, thinking, oh, you know, next week you're going to be really embarrassed and you're going to get help next week. And the doctor said, your dad's a very ill man right now. Again, it went over my head. Didn't listen. No, he's all right. It's fine. We've been here. Like, he'll be all right. Then he got moved to resus, and we had 2 consultants in the room. Now, you know, when you've got 2 consultants in the room, things are getting serious and things are ramping up, and they start talking about blood transfusions. They start talking about internal bleeding because he's got a bruise that's getting bigger and bigger and bigger on his torso. And then they're showing me chest x-rays that they've taken. And where his liver wasn't functioning and filtering the blood, his lungs were filling up with fluid. So there was a rattle to him.
Yep.
And they showed me these chest x-rays, and they said, you know, your dad's lungs are 3/4 of the way full with fluid. Look at the shadows here. Walked out of that room again, didn't take it seriously, went back, and at that point I thought, I'm going now. I've got to go back to the kids. I've been here all day. They were moving him to a ward. They were going to do an endoscopy but they were worried to do that because they were worried about the veins in the esophagus. And I kissed him on his head and I looked at him and I said, I love you. And he took his mask off and he looked me directly in the eye, and he knew who I was at this point, and he went, I love you. And that was the last thing he ever said to me. The last thing. And I walked away and I had that feeling again of like, it was this all-encompassing feeling that he's not going to be here. But I didn't believe it. And it was so strange. It was so weird. So I went back home. Again, people didn't realise how bad it was. They thought it was minor. The next day, he was moved to intensive care. He was moved to intensive care through the night. And he was placed on dialysis. And we walked into intensive care to see him. And as soon as we walked through the doors, Mum had a phone call, and the hospital were ringing my mum, and the curtains were drawn around my dad. And me and my younger sister just looked at each other and we knew. And then this surgeon come out and he looked defeated, if I'm honest. He just looked tired and defeated, and he came in and he sat down. He said, we need to have that talk. And I thought, well, where's this coming from? I was shocked. Almost like I weren't expecting it. And I should have been, because all the signs were there, but I weren't admitting it. I was in denial. There's an irony to that as well, isn't there? But he sat us down and he said, he listed off every single symptom my dad was having. His fingers are going white, and, you know, his body, the fluid, the dialysis machine can't keep up with the amount of fluid that he's producing, and the kidneys are starting to shut down. This is starting to and he started listing like everything in stages. And I just stopped him and I said, is he going to survive? And he looked down and he said, your dad's got a 15% chance of surviving this. That's if he doesn't have a heart attack when I place him onto a ventilator. And at that point, I got up and I walked out. And I went and begged him. I went by my dad's side and I begged him. And he was breathing funny. And I remember at that point, and I remember thinking, God, I'm being really selfish asking him to stick around and fight this. Because he's done. He's done. He's had enough. And he didn't want help. He was so stubborn. He was so set in his way. He was so sucked in by that stigma at that point. Didn't want to admit to having poor mental health. Didn't want to talk about depression or PTSD or being an alcoholic. He was tired. Like days before when we had heart to heart on the phone, he said, I don't recognise this world anymore. And I remember thinking, I'm being really selfish by asking you to stick around. But I went into a state of shock at that point. Everything around me blacked out. And I remember I can't really remember much after it, but I know I left. And my husband came to the hospital to be with him. And my husband did all the talking on behalf of all of us. And it was my husband that come and told me that it's up to you, but there's nothing else they can do. They're going to switch off the machine. Would you like to come and say goodbye? I thought, I can't do it. I can't. And he pulled me aside and he said, I think you should try. I think you'll regret it if you don't. And I'm so glad I did, because I did. And I went back and I said everything I needed to. I told him, I don't blame you. The nurse said to me, his hearing, he'll still be able to hear you. That'll be the last thing that will go. So tell him, talk to him. So I did. I told him everything. I told him I loved him. I didn't blame him and said I was sorry. And it was in that moment where I thought, there's two ways I can go here. There are two ways. I either follow in my dad's footsteps, I carry on pretending that everything's fine, and I carry on showing up this idyllic, sensible, respectable image, or I get help for my mental health and I do something with this, because I don't want to have my girls turning off my life support in 20 years' time. And thankfully I took that route. And I believe to this day that my dad saved me.
Well said.
I really do.
Yeah. Wow. And having all that, dealing with your mental health issues and coming out the other side and listening to everything you went through as a child and a teenager and growing up into a woman, what would you say to somebody listening to this podcast who has an addiction, whether it be to alcohol, whether it be to cocaine, whether it be to something else, who has an addiction, who has children, who hasn't woken up yet? Maybe they're thinking about it, they want to get help, they haven't sought help. From a child's perspective of having a parent who has an addiction, what would you say to the parent listening now who has an addiction to think about their child? What would you tell them?
God, that's a really good question. I actually haven't been asked that before. And it's a really difficult one to answer because I'm not a clinician, and I always say that to people. I'm not a clinician. I'm not qualified to give advice. But from a lived experience perspective, and I know you can only get help if you want it. You have to really want it. And although my dad tried for us, that wasn't enough. He needed it. He needed to want it for him. But from the child's perspective, and watching that and the damage that causes, I would urge them to just try. Talk to somebody, try and have an open, honest conversation with your children. Talk to them about it. Don't brush it under the carpet, because I find with alcohol addiction, it's a taboo subject. Any addiction subject is a taboo.
Any addiction, cocaine, alcohol, methamphetamine, doesn't matter what it is.
It's a taboo subject. So it's brushed under the carpet and it becomes this dirty family secret. And then the children, I believe, are often gaslighted because they're told it's fine, everything's fine, but their surroundings and their reality, what they're experiencing, isn't fine. So it's confusion. It creates a level of confusion. So I would say open, honest dialogue, letting them know. You might think that they're too young, or you might think, oh, it's embarrassing, but no, it's not. Because the one thing, the biggest thing I would say that's done me the most damage is the reality being denied. All of that, what I was seeing and what I was being told were contradicting. So I'm told everything's fine. I'm not an alcoholic. You're imagining things. You're being dramatic. And then he died of alcohol addiction. It's a massive, it's a head fuck.
Of course it is.
It is. Your whole entire reality is doubted. I would say, don't get sucked up by the stigma. Talk to somebody. Talk to your family. Have those open, honest conversations. Yes, you can only do it for yourself, as in get sober. But talk to them. Let them know. Let them in. And
what I'm about to say is quite harsh, but it's a reality. Because the fact is, if you don't, you could end up like your dad did and then leaving the children behind.
Yeah.
And I think what makes this quite a powerful podcast, different to all the other podcasts, is I'm not speaking to somebody who has an addiction this time. I'm speaking to somebody who's gone through growing up with a person who has an addiction. I think that's very different. I think it's very interesting. What motivated you to begin your advocacy work campaigning against the stigma of addiction on behalf of adult children of alcoholics, and you're involved in a charity? Tell us about that.
So that goes back to that time in intensive care, switching off that machine and, that crossroads, what route do I take? And it really hit me in the face how bad the stigma is attached to all addictions, but I was specifically targeting alcohol addiction. The doctor who tried saving my dad was absolutely amazing, and I'd be lying if I didn't say that he didn't have some kind of influence in me. He was very kind enough to give some time up to discuss my dad's files and discuss what happened with us while we were more aware. And he sat there and he said, I'm seeing more and more deaths from alcohol and more patients in intensive care. He was opposite your dad. There was a 21-year-old on a ventilator because of binge drinking. He said, I'm seeing more and more of this, and it makes me really angry because cigarettes are covered behind a screen and there's the graphic warning labels on them. He went, but all you get on a bottle of alcohol is drink responsibly, and it's in your face wherever you go. It's glamorized. It's marketed heavily. You're told to drink. You're encouraged to drink. Nobody knows it causes physical dependence. There's no warning label on that like there is a pack of cigarettes. God, that fueled something. And inside me, I got really cross because then the comments came. When I talk about my dad's death, people and I believe they were intended comments. They were trying to make me feel better, but it didn't. It made me angry. They said, your dad did this to himself. He only had himself to blame and it was self-inflicted. It's not your fault. I remember thinking, but that other relative died from smoking too much and you didn't blame his death on smoking. You had empathy and compassion. You don't want to talk to me about my dad. You don't want to talk about the good memories you've had with him. You're so focused and fixated on how this was his fault and he did this to himself. And it really made me really angry. And then more people would come forward and they'd say, oh, alcoholics should have their NHS rights taken away. That made me cross. And I started doing my research and I discovered that 80% of disease is caused by lifestyle choices, what we eat, what we drink, what we smoke, lack of exercise. And then I'd hear stories of nurses saying that they get really angry with alcoholics and they'd rather treat stroke victims and heart attack patients. And in my head, I'm thinking, yeah, but their heart attack and their stroke has probably been caused by a lifestyle choice. And I mean that with the utmost of respect. What I'm saying is you can't single out alcohol addiction as being self-inflicted and pummel somebody and belittle somebody and discriminate somebody and tell somebody that they're not worthy of NHS treatment.
It's a disease.
It's absolutely.
Just like cancer.
Yeah, I agree, 100%. And that made me so angry and it fueled this thing in me. But I was still embarrassed. I still weren't really telling people publicly how my dad died until one day where I really weren't scared anymore, didn't care about the stigma. And I realised if I want to make change and I want to destigmatise, I have to be comfortable enough with my story. I'll have to own my story. I have to talk about it honestly and openly. And I do. I talk about it really brutally honestly. I'll put myself on a firing line sometimes and admit to stuff that I've said and done because that's my truth. I spoke to a journalist about feeling relief when my dad died. That's not a nice thing to talk about, and I did get some backlash, but it's my truth. Yeah. I did feel relief when he died. Relief that he weren't suffering.
You got backlash from that?
Yeah, I did.
I think unless somebody walks in your own shoes, how on earth can somebody judge you?
No, exactly. And this is it. And people don't understand it. They don't. There's so many complexities to it. There's so many nuances to it. Everybody's experience as being that child of an alcoholic or that loved one of an addict is different. They're all different.
I've got a question for you, sitting opposite me, looking into your blue eyes. What colour eyes did your dad have?
Blue, same as me.
And do you know there's an interesting thing about blue eyes? Do you know this?
No.
Do you know there's a genetic predisposition with your chromosomes that you're more likely to become an alcoholic if you have blue eyes?
Oh, I didn't
Fact.
know that. Did
Latest
not know
research. Fact.
So, do you know, this is
Doesn't
really,
mean just because you've got blue eyes, everyone's going to become an alcoholic or addicted to drugs. What it does mean is the propensity due to the chromosomes, you're more likely to.
So my dad and me have the same eyes. If I take my makeup off and look in the mirror, and it sounds really cheesy and really cliche, but I'm like, oh, I look like my dad. I can see it. So he did. He did have the same colour eyes as me.
Sarah, last question for you. What would you say to addiction if it was a person?
Now this, I do have an answer to, and this is a controversial one, and people look at me like, what?
I like a bit of controversial stuff.
I would say thank you. Because, I'll explain why. My dad found a way to cope. And although he wasn't always drunk, and it might sound contradicting again, there was moments of bonding that I had with him, beautiful things he said to me, beautiful things we spoke about. And he always used to say to me, if I didn't drink, I would be dead. Never got it at the time. I was too young to understand what he meant by that. He found a coping mechanism, and that was his. He found a way to cope, and it weren't a healthy way to cope. And I wish he would have found another way. But that was those were the cards we were dealt as a family. Yeah. And alcohol was his addiction. It was his way to cope. There were moments that I can cherish, look back on and think, yeah, there were some beautiful memories. There were less beautiful memories than there were nice, horrible ones, but there were still beautiful memories within that. And I do believe, with the way my dad was, his character, his makeup, that without alcohol he would have been dead. I believe that he probably would have taken his own life.
And you also said your father didn't abuse alcohol, but was abused by alcohol.
Yeah, I mean that. I genuinely believe that.
It's a very powerful statement.
I think, yes, he had a choice at the beginning to pick it up. Like with anything, any addiction, we all have that choice at the beginning. But it's a toxic, highly addictive substance that isn't designed to be moderated. It's designed to be addictive. And at that point, it started abusing him. And when he became physically dependent on it, and this is what frustrates me when people say, well, it's their choice and they should just stop. He didn't have a choice. When he was dependent on it, he didn't have a choice. And the sad thing is, he would have rather stayed silent and put up with his addiction than ask for help because of the embarrassment. He was ashamed. He said that to me. He said, I've done it to myself and I'll get out of it myself. He was so ashamed of it. So it's, yeah.
Sarah, I really appreciate coming clean with me. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for sharing your story about your dad, Steve, and everything else. Really appreciate your time. Thank you.